Welcome to the Campaign Nonviolence Skill Building webinar series. This is our third module. My name is Ken Budigan. I'm the Executive Director of Pace Bene Nonviolence Service and an organizer with Campaign Nonviolence. And we appreciate all that you're doing to create a better world. And you'll see here an image of one of the 240 nonviolent actions that took place when we launched Campaign Nonviolence last September. This happens to be in Wilmington, Delaware. And this fall, we're organizing hundreds of nonviolent actions in our second annual Week of Nonviolent Actions in every state in the country. And we highly encourage you to either join an action that's being organized, calling for an end to war, poverty, the climate crisis, the epidemic of violence, and to create and nurture a culture of peace, or to organize one yourself. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight, is nonviolent action. So Ryan, if you could put the title slide up there. So we've been organizing these webinars the last few weeks. And this is in addition to face-to-face Campaign Nonviolence Skill Building workshops. Last year we organized 4 in various parts of the country, and we're organizing more this year. But in addition to face-to-face workshops, we're offering these this series of webinars. It's not the same as face-to-face workshop, but I do encourage you to gather whatever tools you can from these webinars, which you can see them on YouTube as well as here live tonight. And also think about organizing events locally that would use some of these tools and exercises and dynamics in our work to build a better world. So we're privileged to have Ryan Hall, who is the office manager of Pace Bene, again, managing this call. Thanks so much, Ryan, for all the work you do to build a world where everyone matters. Let's go to that next slide there, Ryan. I wanted to start off tonight with a quotation from John Paul Lederach. John Paul Lederach teaches at the University of Notre Dame in the Kroc Institute for Peace there, and he's written many great books on conflict transformation, on just peace, and he wrote a book called The Moral Imagination. And I want to just offer, as we begin our focus tonight on nonviolent action, to step back and look at it in a larger context. Here's what John Paul Lederach has to say. Transcending violence is forged by the capacity to generate, mobilize, and build the moral imagination. Stated simply, the moral imagination requires the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemy. Let's go to the next one. It includes the ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity, that is, us versus them thinking. We're the good people and they're the bad people. Third, the fundamental belief in and pursuit of the creative act. Nonviolent action is, if nothing else, creative, because violence is actually not that creative. And so we're offering something that offers an alternative and generates that creativity. And finally, the acceptance of the inherent risk of stepping into the mystery of the unknown beyond the too familiar landscape of violence. So tonight, when we look at nonviolent action, we invite ourselves and others to deeply develop the moral imagination, the one that says we're all part of this system. those we like and those we don't necessarily like too much. We're all part of it. We can embrace complexity. Because violence actually says it's very simple. And in fact, it's not as simple as it often proposes. That it is a possibility and probability and potential of creating an alternative to engage in a creative act. And finally, to step into the unknown. As I often say in workshops, when we're engaging in nonviolence, we have at most half the script. And even then, not so much. But at most, we have half the script. We are engaging with others who don't have the same script. Is there a way to weave a script together that meets the needs of all parties, that helps find a way to a win-win? And that can be in our relationships, that can be in our community, but it also can be in our world. And each of us engaging with this webinar tonight has more power than we think to make change, to make a world that works for all of us. So Ryan, if we could go to the next slide. So we've been offering this series of modules. The first looked at the vision of Campaign Nonviolence, long-term effort to nurture a culture of peace by mainstreaming nonviolence, by connecting the dots between issues and coming together across movements, in fact, to build a movement of movements, and finally, to take action together, not simply to criticize the status quo, but to change the status quo, and to do that actively, creatively, in this, using this active and powerful, liberating energy of nonviolence. Last week, we looked specifically at what are some of the ways of understanding how social change happens. It doesn't just happen. And we looked at a few models, including the work of Bill Moyer, who wrote a really great book called Doing Democracy. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in social change, Google Doing Democracy by Bill Moyer, and you'll see a really wonderful book that takes us through the 8 stages of a social movement, that shows all the different roles of activism, and then how do we alert, educate, win, and mobilize the populace to withdraw our consent from a world where only some benefit and create a world where everyone benefits. And then this week, building on these two, this looking at the vision of Campaign Nonviolence and looking at what nonviolence is, this love in action, or as Dr. King put it, the love that does justice. And then last week, looking at how we actually make social change. This week, we're going to build on that by inviting ourselves and others to look at what nonviolent action might look like. How could we organize nonviolent action? And we're especially interested in inviting ourselves and others to organize nonviolent action in all 50 states this September 20th through the 27th, for our second annual week of nonviolent actions as part of Campaign Nonviolence. It's part of a long-term effort to build a culture of peace, but also to say we're going to connect the dots, and we're going to call for a world where nonviolent options increasingly become the default. So we're going to look specifically at how do we build nonviolent action? How does that fit into a larger strategy or campaign? So if we'll take the next slide there, Ryan. So tonight, looking at nonviolent actions, building a local campaign, and then finally, Pace Bene and Campaign Nonviolence put out a vision for this September. Not only public witness, which is very important, and we already have over 100 nonviolent actions that people have told us they're organizing, but also that in addition to those public actions, we hope to have hundreds of them this September. We invite people to engage both in and a nonviolent interaction with somebody that they are in struggle with. Could be somebody in their family, could be somebody down the street, could be somebody who you have a political difference with. It could be the President of the United States. To engage in nonviolent interaction, we're going to talk a bit about that tonight. And then finally, this really wonderful idea, can we take one day that week, again, September 20 through the 27th, and fast from violence, to make a commitment ourselves to say, I'm not going to engage in any violence, emotional, verbal, physical, institutional, social, structural, for 24 hours. And it'd be great if you let us know what you're planning to do and what happened after you do that. Maybe you'll want to go for a week without violence, or maybe a month, or a year, or the rest of our lives. So we're going to be looking at all of those things tonight. Ryan, if we can go to the next slide. So this again is our agenda for tonight. And let me just stop and emphasize one of the agenda items here, the challenge and opportunity of this webinar. As I said, we did nonviolent workshops and skill building workshops across the country last year, and we're doing some this year. It's a very different thing to do it online. We potentially reach many more people online, but it's harder to do a lot of the things that we do in a workshop, which include small group reflection, which include role plays and exercises, and also a lot more time. We take a couple of days for those skill building workshops. We only have a short amount of time tonight. We've had a short amount of time in the 2 previous webinars, in the modules. And so what we're doing is lifting up various highlights, but there are some resources online that we posted that you can build on. You can try some of these exercises in your communities. And you can also look at organizing a face-to-face workshop in the future. So we're going to look at creating nonviolent action, building the movement, interpersonal nonviolent engagement, fasting from violence. And then toward the end, we're going to open some space for any questions or responses. But feel free to send along any questions that the Google Hangouts venue allows you to do, and try to get to those. All right, Ryan, let's go to the next slide. So again, just as a way to launch for those of us who haven't been on the other modules, or just because it's important to see what we're rooting this in, Campaign Nonviolence. This is a long-term movement to build a culture of peace, free from war, poverty, the climate crisis, and the epidemic of violence. How? By mainstreaming nonviolence. As crazy and as beautiful as that sounds, how can we bring the power, the teaching, the methods of nonviolence throughout our society? How do we get that into every K through 12 public school and private school across the United States, for example? How do we help ourselves and others see there's actually a long history of effective and powerful and successful nonviolence? And then how do we bring it into our own lives, in our relationships, in our community, and so forth? So mainstreaming nonviolence, but also connecting the issues. We're going to be more powerful if we get out of our silos. If while we might be working on ending poverty, but don't really have much to do with the environment or with war, and vice versa, there is a power that is going to come from building a movement of movements. And then finally, taking action. This isn't just discussing an alternative, seeing what's terrible and then wringing our hands. We get to use the most powerful language we have at our disposal, our own beautiful, resilient, vulnerable, creaky bodies, to have a conversation with our society. So taking nonviolent action, delivering the message in person. Last year, we launched this with hundreds of actions across the country in all 50 states. 196 national and local organizations endorsed Campaign Nonviolence. There are hundreds of organizers and promoters across the US who are again gearing up for nonviolent action this September. And we have two really great things coming up. First, our national conference, which is going to take place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, August 6th through 9th, with two powerful vigils at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is the birthplace of nuclear weapons. On the 70th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we're going to take a pilgrimage to Los Alamos and engage in nonviolent witness there. And then in between those two witnesses, those two nonviolent actions on the 6th and the 9th, we will be holding this really great conference with some of the leading voices for nonviolence of our time, including Reverend James Lawson, who's a great icon of nonviolence training during the civil rights movement, has been tirelessly working for justice ever since, and Dr. Erica Chenoweth, whose research has shown that nonviolent strategies are actually twice as effective as violent ones. So let's go to the next slide, right? So first of all, we want to build a movement. And last week we talked about different aspects of how nonviolent change happens. And tonight we're going to look at actually building a nonviolent action locally in your local area. And that's part of a larger effort, a particular nonviolent witness, a march, a rally, a demonstration, a nonviolent festival for justice, peace, and sustainability. These are embedded in a larger, long-term effort for nonviolent change. So we invite you to think about organizing a public, visible, nonviolent action this September in your community, but also see it as part of a larger effort to build a movement to mainstream nonviolence, to connect the dots, and to take ongoing action for a world that sorely needs an alternative to violence and injustice. So it means building, either building on efforts that your own communities or organizations already are doing, or actually stepping out and creating one yourself. That's going to include strategy, like what is the roadmap we're going to take, not just this year, for the next 5 years, or maybe even the next 15 or 20 years. Messaging. How do we say, how does our, not only our words, but our actions, how do these actually convey that we're committed to active and creative nonviolence? And then how do we convey that we're overcoming these divisions in our movements and coming together and creating a movement of movements? And then the outreach. How do we connect with people who all across your community or across the nation want to see a better world, but have never been invited into it, wouldn't know the first thing about how to get in touch and connected? In addition, how do we outreach with people who are working for a better world, but have never heard about your work, or you've never heard about theirs? Can we sit down and have a potluck together? Can we share our stories? Can we come together in a way that makes change possible? Can we find people in our community? When we did a workshop in Los Angeles last year, we sat down and we took about 3 hours and just named every organization in the entire Southland who are working on the environment, who are working on poverty, who are working on the questions around war, but also other organizations, because we want to see we want to take a direct stand against all violence. So whether that's around police brutality or mass incarceration or immigration or many other things that are preventing us from having a world where it works for everyone. So I invite you to think tonight, after this online workshop, to sit down and actually think about all the different organizations in your area that maybe you're not connecting with. What a powerful thing would it be to lift the phone up and say, I want to learn more about what you're doing. How can I support what you're doing? Oh, and by the way, we're doing this thing. in the fall? Is there a way that all of us can come together in a way that builds the capacity of all the work that we're doing? Media, social media and traditional media. The importance of framing what we're doing, relentlessly getting that message out. Of course, finances. The importance of being able to pay for those flyers or to pay for any kind of props that we would need for any of the actions that we do to help sustain this work over the long run. Finances and fundraising. And finally, logistics. It's really critical for any kind of action that we do that we figure out all the props, transportation, communication, what would we need for any rally? Do we need speakers? Do we need any number of things to help make that happen? So in terms of building the movement, I highly encourage you either to support efforts already going on in your area, where many of these categories of work are already happening, have been happening maybe for decades. But also, we have more power than we think, and I highly encourage you to let that really sink in, to marinate in that idea that you have more power than you think to make a better world. And often it takes these building blocks. And often, if we have a particular skill or leaning in a particular direction, to really run with it and invite other people to do other parts of the work. All right, Ryan, let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to look at some of these categories, but specifically around developing a particular nonviolent action. And as a way to think about that, I first want to share with you a couple of examples from my own experience around that. And many years ago, I was a member of a little affinity group, and that's another thing to think about. Support groups for study, for discourse, for discussion, for action and action support. And affinity groups are usually 5 to 15 people who meet on a regular basis. Could be once a month, could be once a week, could be every other week, could be once a year, who knows. That usually engages in some kind of study. For example, at Pace Bene, we have a book called Engage, Exploring Nonviolent Living. That is a 12-part session that small groups can lead themselves over the course of 12 weeks or 12 months or 12 years, for that matter. It's a way of really going into personal, interpersonal, and social structural violence and nonviolence. So affinity groups are really important, and it's really hard to change the world by ourselves. Often, if we try to do that by ourselves, we'll often be destroyed by it. We need other beautiful, cranky, resilient human beings to make that happen. And my own experience, I've been in several affinity groups, and in a way, Pace Bene with staff, even though we're spread out across the country, we function as a kind of affinity group for ourselves. Who do you have affinity with? What are some connections, friends, colleagues? There are teachers affinity groups, nurses affinity groups, student affinity groups, clergy affinity groups, etc. So way back in the 1980s, when I was a baby activist, when I was first getting involved in work around, in that case, the effort to create a nuclear-free future, a world without nuclear weapons. I was part of this group, of Spirit Affinity Group, and it had a kind of philosophy, which was it didn't like to just take things right off the shelf. It didn't want to just take an action just because somebody else had done something like that. Dr. King had done it like that, or Gandhi had done it like that. So what we did was we would sit in a room, we would turn the lights off, we would light a candle, we would sit and we would wait for the gesture, the word, the drama, the idea, the action that would somehow communicate very clearly what we were about, what the goal was, that would engage the moral imagination of our society, of our neighborhood, of our community, of our world. And so we were thinking about a nonviolent action at a Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which designed 50% of the US nuclear arsenal, about 50 miles from San Francisco, California, east of San Francisco. And we wanted to do a very powerful nonviolent action. We didn't know what that would entail. So we sat in a circle, we lit a candle, we turned the lights off, and we just waited. We waited a long time. And then after about an hour or so, this vision started to come, which was, at that time, the laboratory was working on what was called at that time the MX missile. And it was going to be the most horrific nuclear weapon ever created, capable of destroying hundreds of cities, because they had these cluster nuclear weapons that would deploy once it was in space and so on, and go to different targets. President Reagan at the time called it the peacemaker. Well, we knew that that was not the way of making peace, and we wanted to somehow communicate that. So we decided that we would make a mock-up of the MX missile, and it turned out to be extremely heavy. But anyway, an artist friend worked with us on this, and we ended up carrying it in this very solemn, very long missile, very solemn procession with several hundred people. And we finally laid it into the intersection in front of one of the main gates of the laboratory. And then we chained ourselves to it. And as if to dramatize a die-in or a way of showing, indicating in a very, very small and very symbolic way the impact of a weapon like that. And this hadn't been done before. Usually people proceeded right to the gate, but this was in the intersection near the gate, and traffic began to back up, and then people filled in the intersection and engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience while we were there. And finally, the police figured out, they brought bolt cutters and cut us free from the missile, and they brought a Department of Energy truck to drag it away. And by doing that, they, wittingly or not, were part of our scenario. Because actually what we had hoped in the end was we didn't stay there forever, that actually symbolically the government would disarm its own weapon. And in effect, that's what it did. It came and dragged this symbol away. And we later learned that when we tried to get it, when we went to trial, we wanted to use it as evidence. But they said, oh no, you'll never get it. It's at the bottom of the Livermore dump. And we took that also to be symbolic, that they had symbolically, well, I would have liked to have seen them recycle it, and maybe today that's what they would do. They symbolically carried out the work of disarmament that we had hoped for, and that actually had been our intention, is that would be dramatized in that way. So what did we learn from that action? That there was power in not simply saying, oh, let's do another march or rally. We wanted to do something that would somehow speak and dramatize, speak to and dramatize what is called for at that time. And this was one of many thousands of nonviolent actions that happened around nuclear weapons. And there's growing evidence that that movement had an impact on a series of arms control agreements that were written in the 1980s and the 1990s. It created the conditions for not only the then Soviet leadership, because this was happening not just in the United States, it was happening in the former Soviet Union as well, the Soviet leadership to come to the table, but also President Reagan to come to the table, and later President George Bush I. But it also helped create the conditions for a comprehensive test ban treaty that was promulgated in the early 1990s, that a worldwide anti-nuclear movement, one action after another, one activity after another, alerted, educated, and mobilized the population to demand that change happen and to pull back from the nuclear precipice. There was polling in the early 1980s that suggested that 75% of the US population was in favor of modernizing nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapons complex. Within a couple of years, after all of these actions and also the nuclear freeze, that number flipped. 75% were against nuclear weapons and wanted to see change. Now, the other thing we learned from an action like that and that campaign is that, again, as I stressed last week, nonviolent action and nonviolent campaigns and nonviolent movements are not about utopia. There are 5 steps forward and 1 step back, or maybe 87 steps forward and 27 steps back. They're not about creating utopia or an ideal world, but they are about helping to open the possibilities and move if we do it right, the planet forward for liberation and transformation. And I believe that little action that some of us engaged in, I think something like 200 of us were arrested as part of that, that played an important, small, but I'd say significant role in that. When we think about these things, I invite us to think about a public witness, nonviolent, centered, composed, love and action that will communicate the message that you want to see for a world that works for everyone. So I encourage you and your community to gather in a circle, light a candle, turn the lights off, and just wait. What is a gesture, a word, a drama that comes that you remember, and that will come to you, that you can then take forward into action? And then you get into all of these very logistical things around the props and transportation and press releases and organizing, and of course nonviolent action. I would also add one more story here, which is that we are just this past weekend, the world gathered in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador, to honor what's called the Beatification of Monsignor Archbishop Oscar Romero. And that was an amazing and powerful time this weekend to see that Romero's own community, the Catholic Church, is finally honoring the amazing witness for peace and justice and nonviolence that Archbishop Romero left to all of us and helped create the conditions for a new El Salvador. And I'm also reminded that on the 10th anniversary of his assassination, that is to say, March 24th, 1990, I joined with 15,000 people who marched from the US Capitol to the White House to honor Romero, to call for an end to US policies in Central America, including funding death squad government in El Salvador, and calling for peace throughout Central America. And I just mentioned what we did in that nonviolent action. I was one of the organizers. I was at that time the national coordinator of something called the Pledge of Resistance in Washington, which was a nationwide effort to build a Central America direct action, nonviolent direct action arm of the Central America movement. And we organized a Central America village in front of the White House, with houses and churches and halls and a huge paper mache bust, huge, of Oscar Romero, which we then carried into Pennsylvania Avenue and then looked directly into the White House because of its policies that had created so much destruction in Romero's homeland. We actually were quite concerned that we weren't going to be able to build this village. So we had little pieces of each church or each house under our shirts. And then when we got to the gate in front of the White House, we brought them out and rapidly put this Lego-like village together. It was powerful. And then Romero is accompanied into the area in front of the White House. That again came out of a whole process of dreaming and thinking, how do we help make the reality present? I would invite us to do that as well. So we are in a time when we need to stimulate the moral imagination. And I highly recommend that you do that as well. How do we create an action that connects the dots between war, poverty, climate crisis, and all forms of violence, police brutality, the militarization of the police, mass incarceration, a broken immigration system, and so on. So I invite us to seriously consider doing that as we go forward. Ryan, why don't we go to the next slide? So as part of your nonviolent action, and you can see this on the Campaign Nonviolence website, but I think we can also post this with the other resources after this call that we've been putting online so that you can look more deeply into these different elements of building Campaign Nonviolence. As part of our work, we try to create nonviolence guidelines that help create a nonviolent spirit. And so Pachabene and Campaign Nonviolence created what we call the Campaign Nonviolence, the Campaign CNV Nonviolence Agreement. So this is a nonviolent agreement we ask people to abide by and to do trainings around, because that's the best way to prepare people for these actions that we're going to take, so that they maintain this deeply nonviolent spirit, so that we can alert, educate, win, and mobilize the populace and create the conditions for change. So here's how this nonviolence agreement goes. War, poverty, and environmental destruction are colossal forms of violence. In seeking to end them, Campaign Nonviolence rejects the use of violence for any reason and affirms that all Campaign Nonviolence activities will employ nonviolent tactics exclusively. For the purposes of this agreement, violence means behavior involving physical, verbal, or emotional means intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. Let's go to the next slide there, Ryan. Continuing the agreements, nonviolence is a force for transformation, truth, justice, and the well-being of all that is neither violent nor passive. Concretely expressed in CNV actions, nonviolence means a commitment to avoid the use of violence, emotional, verbal, physical, institutional, social, structural, search for the widest possible vista on the truth pertaining to any situation, and being willing to accept the consequences of taking action, including voluntary suffering if necessary, to contribute to bringing a conflict to a just resolution. There are many dimensions to this, and actually it would be very helpful and useful if in your local groups you were to spend an evening, an hour and a half, 2 hours, reflecting on this particular way of trying to maintain a nonviolent spirit and why that is so important. And some of that we touched on in the first 2 modules, in the first 2 weeks of this webinar series. One thing I want to lift up is in that last point there, being willing to accept the consequences of taking action, including voluntary suffering if necessary, to contribute to bringing a conflict to a just resolution. So involuntary suffering is the worst evil on the planet and must be resisted with every fiber of our being. And we cannot accept involuntary suffering. Voluntary suffering, however, at some time, in some places, often is the most powerful commitment we can make, the most powerful gift we can make to the world. In this sense, not that we court suffering, but to face the consequences for taking our nonviolence public, to face the consequences. And sometimes those are quite severe. But when we think about, for example, what Rosa Parks did, really at the beginning of the modern era of nonviolent action in this country, but in lots of other places as well, she is, in a sense, well, it's like this. A system of domination and violence puts a circle of magical immunity around itself. And it says, go to the mall, or go see a show, or go here, or go there, but don't come anywhere near this. What Rosa Parks does by sitting on that bus almost, well, it is almost 60 years ago, is that she jumps right into the middle of that circle of magical immunity that the systems put around themselves and says, I'm going to non-violently disrupt this. I'm going to make waves. I'm going to be in the midst of that. Well, she's opening herself up to enormous consequences, even death. But she does this knowing full well, and she'd been trained at the Highlander Center 6 months before in nonviolent action for justice. She knew what she was getting into, but she voluntarily faced the consequences of that possibility. And that's what some of the power, a lot of the power of nonviolent action comes from. The willingness to use the most powerful language at our disposal, our own vulnerable bodies, in that way. It's not something we should take lightly or do lightly. This is where training is important. But that voluntarily willingness to face the consequences, or as Daniel Berrigan, longtime activist, says, to pay up in a certain way. All right. Ryan, let's go to the next slide. So, and this is the last part of the agreement. Actually, there are 2 more parts to it. Campaign Nonviolent Actions will have these characteristics in common. The attitude of participants will be one of openness, friendliness, and respect toward all people encountered. Participants will use no violence, verbal or physical, toward any person, including in reaction to violence. Participants will carry no weapons. Let's go to the next one. Participants will not destroy or damage property. Participants will not bring or use drugs except for medicinal purposes or alcohol. Participants will not seek to avoid the consequences of their actions. And this particular set of agreements has been adapted from Oregon Peaceworks in the state of Oregon, but also draws on numerous movements for nonviolent change that have found it really important to help set guidelines and a tenor and a mood so that the focus can be on the issue rather than on our violence. Ryan, let's go to the next slide. All right, so we've looked briefly at nonviolent action. We encourage you, as I said, about 100 nonviolent actions are already being planned 4 months from now. We highly recommend that you plan an action yourself or join with one locally. If you see that nothing's happening, you can begin the process of organizing one yourself and let us know. You can go to the Campaign Nonviolence website and see the icon for the 2015 Action Week. Click on that and it will show you all the actions that are happening by state across the country. If you don't see something happening in your state or in your city, we highly recommend that you get with some other people and organize a nonviolent action, a march, a rally, or another nonviolent creative event. In addition to that, we are encouraging ourselves and others to engage in a nonviolent encounter, especially with people we don't agree with that week. And let us know that that's happening, and we will publicize that all across the country. One of the reasons we want to know about whatever public actions you're doing or these encounters is that we are raising the visibility of these actions across the United States. And that's what's going to be happening. And so to help us with that process, in our skill building workshops, we offer what we call the Clara Process, which is a process of nonviolent communication. It draws on a variety of dynamics and processes and techniques that have been developed, including by the late Marshall Rosenberg's program called Nonviolent Communication, but also a really great one, another great one called Taking the War Out of Our Words, The Art of Powerful Non-Defensive Communication by Sharon Ellison. Really highly recommend exploring this amazing program of non-defensive communication that Sharon Ellison has developed. She's a psychotherapist who had heard too many clients over 30 years say, we can't communicate, and then turns out there's all this defensiveness, and then things escalate. And she analyzed that and has developed a really great way for inviting us in our life to use different approaches to communication differently, especially questions, statements, and predictions. So I highly recommend looking into that. So we at Pace Bene took bits and pieces from these different programs and developed something called the Clara Process, which is a 5-step process for nonviolent exchange. And it's helpful in our own lives. It's helpful in our families or our workplaces or with those people down the street we don't like very much. But it's also a model that can be used in nonviolent social change. A model that helps us build our movements that are active and powerful and nonviolent. And so I want to briefly go over this, this particular method. And again, we highly recommend thinking about offering this in your own communities. And there's more about that on our website. And we also, this is also part of our Engage, Exploring Nonviolent Living study book. So Clara, there are 5 parts to it: to center, to learn, to articulate, to receive, and to accomplish. To center, to learn, articulate, receive, accomplish. So this acronym Clara which also can mean clarity, it can mean light. And that's what we're trying to get to, some clarity, some way of shedding light, and then also getting to a win-win. So to center, learn, articulate, receive, and accomplish. And again, in face-to-face workshops, we spend a lot of time looking at what this model entails, but also practicing it, which of course we can't do very well online. Basically, I invite people to set up in 2 parallel lines facing each other, and I ask one side to have gotten this process, this Clara process. They've studied it. The other side act as if they haven't studied it, and then I give them a scenario, and then we see, can they get to an accomplishment? What does that entail, and what are ways of increasing our skills for nonviolent communication? And then we switch sides and we switch back. At one point, I invite them to regard the person across from them the way they regard the most beloved person in their lives. First one side to do that, and then both sides. And it's a powerful practice. And what if we actually did that in our lives? What if we regarded anybody who crossed our path the way we regard the most beloved person in our life? It doesn't mean we condone their violence or their injustice. As we said last time, there are 2 hands of nonviolence. I will not cooperate with your injustice, but I'm open to you as a human being. But what would it be like to actually regard people we see the way we regard the most beloved person in their life? Not the most beloved person in our life, but what if we saw them that way? What if we put on those spectacles? What difference would it make in our own spirit as well as in the relationships? So, Clara. So to center, what are ways we center? So often people find themselves gaining composure through breathing, even when we're in the midst of conflict that's blindsided us. We can use that breath that is closer to me than myself, that breath that keeps me alive, that's been with me from the beginning. And sometimes when we're in conflict, we tighten up, or our heart rate increases, or we feel trapped and cornered. And centering is the process of coming back to our true self, being who we are in our depth in this particular conflict, getting in touch with what we're really feeling in the midst of these conflicts and these situations. So centering. And there are lots of ways to do that, through breathing, but also sometimes we do that by recalling a piece of music that is meaningful to us, or recalling a word or a phrase. So Gandhi, for example, when he was 8 years old, his babysitter said, keep on your lips, take deeply within you, keep always attentive to one of the names of one of the high holy gods of Hinduism. Gandhi was a Hindu. In that case, it was Rama, the god Rama. And if you do that when you die, if you have that word, that name on your lips, you will go directly to the divine. Well, Gandhi did that his whole life. In fact, when he was dying, he was repeating that name Rama, or at least one time was saying that name Rama. He had done that his whole life as a spiritual practice, but he also did it throughout his day to remember the divine, to remember the sacred, to remember that all life is sacred, to remember that the person in front of him who was perhaps in struggle with Gandhi was of infinite worth. So what is it for you? that helps you center. I highly recommend each of us get a centering tool, something where we can, in the midst of the conflicts, where we can deal from our true self. I don't know about you, but I've been in probably 5 conflicts today already. And the importance of being ready when you're not expecting it is really, really crucial to that. There are lots of different ways to do this centering. The second dimension here is learning. So often when I'm in a conflict, I, of course, know that I'm right and that I have the whole truth. And there's no way that this person I'm in conflict has a piece of the truth. But in fact, learning, trying to figure out what this conflict really is about. What is the position, and then what's the interest below the position? What is essential, and what is something you can just give away that is not essential in this conflict? That requires actually doing some research, even on the fly, asking curious questions, not designed to win, but designed to learn. So I was in a car crash a couple of years ago, and I was driving one way. I was driving east, and all of a sudden I'm driving west because the car hadn't seen me, I guess, and plowed into me, taking a left-hand turn as I was driving along, and plowed right into me. All of a sudden I'm going the other direction. The airbags came off, and finally an ambulance arrives, and somebody from the local police, and they were there and to learn everything they could about this accident. They wanted to know, was the sun in our eyes? Was somebody watching YouTube videos or on their cell phone? What position was the car? Where did the impact actually happen? Who was in the right of way? All these things had to be discerned. It wasn't just obvious. And a report had to be written. And well, in a way, that's what we have to do in these conflicts. We have to maybe make the assumption that we don't know the whole truth. This actually gets to a key thing from Gandhi. Gandhi is a Hindu, and for Gandhi, truth is God and God is truth. But then Gandhi says, but I'm not God, which means I don't have the whole truth. I've got a piece of the truth, which also means that person I'm in struggle with, I don't like very much necessarily, quite likely has a piece of the truth also. And so we come to a kind of Gandhian hypothesis, even though we're convinced this person has no piece of the truth, to wager that in fact they do. And that if we were to go into every conflict with a Gandhian hypothesis, maybe we can't assume that they have a piece of the truth. Maybe they have a little iota of the truth, or a little quark of the truth, or a little smidgen of the truth, a little itty bitty electron of the truth. What if that attitude were to prevail in our being, because we have only control over ourselves, not anybody else? Perhaps that would open us to saying, oh, yes, I have a piece of the truth, but this other person has a piece of the truth also. This actually leads us to our next step here, which is to articulate. And these are not necessarily in order, but in terms of this model, to be thinking about these different aspects, to articulate. That is to say, to articulate my piece of the truth. What is my piece of the truth? How do I determine what's true and what's excessive, or my own ego, or my own greed, or whatever it is, or my own willingness to win at all costs? What's the piece of the truth here? And sometimes, when Gandhi was asked about this, his followers, one of them said, why do we always have to struggle? And Gandhi said, struggle is great and conflict is great. Gandhi, the glass was never half full or half empty. It was full to overflowing. For him, struggle was great and conflict was great. He said, because if we do it right, I'm going to get my piece of the truth out there. And the person I don't like very much is going to get her piece of the truth or his piece of the truth out there. And then we're going to put those two truths together, come up with a bigger truth. It won't be a utopia, but if we do it right, it will meet the needs, some of the needs, the bigger truth for both parties. And then he says the only way most of the time we can get the piece of the truth out there is through struggle and through conflict. Depending on how you think about that, what metaphor do we use for conflict? Maybe sometimes we think of it as a courtroom or as a battlefield. But what if we think of it as ballet, or as making a cake? Maybe there are different, figuring out the recipe for something. In any case, whatever metaphor we use for it, that engagement and that struggle is critical to coughing up the pieces of the truth and putting those together. That relates to this fourth step of receiving the piece of the truth of the other. Receiving the piece of the truth of the other. And so how do we receive the piece of the truth of the other? How do we create the conditions where you're presenting your piece of the truth, but you're also receiving the piece of the truth of the other? And finally, to accomplish, how do we put those two truths together and create an alternative? The Clara process is a very, very important process for figuring out how do we not only do this interpersonally, but also in our social movements. How can our movements center? How can we learn what's the truth and not the truth? How can we articulate, dramatize, communicate the piece of the truth that this society needs to hear, depends on hearing? How can we receive the piece of the truth of those we're in struggle with? That there might be aspects to the one who is engaging on the other side of the line. What is the piece of the truth that we put those two truths together? And finally, how do we accomplish something that may not be a full utopia, because movements aren't about that, but that help create a better, more enduring reality that increasingly works for all of us. For the last half a century, we've seen one movement after another articulate this stand that everyone is of infinite worth. We must not be excluded, dehumanized, diminished, destroyed. As individuals, as communities, as sectors. And so these liberating struggles against racism, sexism, homophobia, economic injustice, ableism, anti-Semitism, all kinds of efforts to say we all matter. And not to simply say that, but to engage in nonviolent struggle to help create conditions that take us one step and the next step and the next step more into that possibility and that reality. Ryan, let's go to the next slide. So with Clara, I invite you to not only think about that in terms of social movements, but also the idea of creating taking an opportunity the week of the Campaign Nonviolence nationwide actions, September 20th through the 27th, and engaging in a nonviolent engagement. And that may take a few months to identify who is it that you're in struggle with. It could be somebody in your family, it could be somebody down the street, it could be the mayor of your city. And see if you can create the conditions for an engagement and a way of engaging together on a particular issue that you've been struggling around. Let us know if you're going to do that, and we'll post that, and also let us know how it goes. In fact, if you want, you can write up a story about that, and we'll be getting that out. Pictures are also welcome. In this next slide, it's fasting from violence. And this was suggested to us by a local Campaign Nonviolence organizer. And it's a very cool idea, which is, can we take a day that week of the Campaign Nonviolence Week of Actions and decide, you know, it's Thursday. I'm not going to engage in any violence today. Of course, that gets you to think about, well, what is violent? Is it just hitting someone? Is it verbal aggression? Is it institutional injustice? Is it buying sweatshop products? What is violence? And in our workshops, we engage with that question very deeply. Anything that dehumanizes, diminishes, destroys, dominates ourselves or others or the world, the earth. What would it be like to self-consciously go for a day without violence? And not just fasting from violence, but actively engaging in nonviolence. That's the other part of this fast from violence, is also positively and constructively engaging in nonviolence, active, creative, challenging, audacious, nonviolent change. So we encourage you to, this September, either engage in or organize a nonviolent public witness, a march, a rally that you've marched to, and or something that's a nonviolent, creative activity that comes out of deep contemplative reflection. Secondly, to think about, is there a person or even a group could do this with a group that's in opposition? Sometime that week to engage in a nonviolent engagement. And then thirdly, to consider as yourself, what would it be like to take a day of fasting from violence and working for nonviolence and living nonviolence? So these are some of the things that we're going to be inviting us to engage in. And as I said, you can go to our website at campaignonviolence.org and see some very specific ways of both seeing actions that are happening already and letting us know about, even if you don't know the details yet, yeah, we're going to do something in your city or town or state. And then also let us know about a nonviolent engagement that week, and also will you be fasting from violence and engaging in nonviolence for one day that week. So I'd like to now to open it up and see if there are any reflections. I see no one has submitted any questions or reflections yet, but if you have any comments or suggestions, that would be wonderful. And I'll see what I can do in terms of reflecting with them. While I'm waiting for that, if there are any, right, we are planning a major national conference call, and which, unlike kind of the monthly conference calls that we've been doing for the last year and a half, this is going to be a nationwide organizing meeting around the nonviolent actions this September. And we are planning this. Ryan, what is the date again for that conference call?
I believe it's July 9th. I have to double check that though.
Okay, we're going to check. We're going to double check the date for the call. We're about to do an e-blast out about that. But we would like to encourage every one of you to join us for that call. It's I believe it's a Thursday night, and we're going to get this. This is either the 9th or the 16th, and by the end of this call, I think we're going to be able to tell you that. But if you know of somebody who's doing an action, or if you're doing one yourself, we'd like to get a representative of every nonviolent action happening across the country to come on that call, to share with the rest of the nation what you're doing, and to really look at some very concrete things in getting ready for those actions. So by the end of this call, we'll have that date for you. I wanted to, oh, okay. It's July 16th, Thursday, July 16th, and I believe that is at 5 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. Please, please make a note of that, and please plan to join us on that call in about a month and a half or so, a little over a month and a half from now. We're hoping to have somebody from every one of the nonviolent actions across the country. And let me just tell you, it was so exciting last year. Right about this time, we had maybe 30 or so actions that had been pledged. And in the end, it was about 240, 250. There actually may have been more because we didn't hear reporting from everyone. So we think it actually was probably more than that. But it started to really build in the summer. And it was so exciting to hear that in every state in the country, and actually places beyond the United States, people were planning to take nonviolent action. We had a great action in Kabul, Afghanistan, where the Afghan peace volunteers, these wonderful young people in their teens and early 20s from every ethnic group in Afghanistan, who are living together and working together, who are bound and determined to create a nonviolent Afghan future. They organized a great action in Kabul. There was a great action in Colombia. We had wonderful activity in American Samoa, a week of actions there, and then actions that happened in Canada and other places. And now we've also heard from various places around the world that they're planning to join in the Campaign Nonviolence Week of Actions in September. Please join us for that. When we take action, we are again putting into practice the principles of active, creative, challenging nonviolence. So again, some of the principles of nonviolence that Mohandas Gandhi experimented with, developed, and lived by. Seek the truth. I may only have a piece of the truth, and maybe that person I don't like very much, she has a piece of the truth. And so we're going to engage in a process, sometimes very strong, public, and disciplined process to try to cough up those pieces of the truth, to create or to affirm a larger truth. Love the enemies. What does it mean? Gandhi would say, some of my own transformation will come out of my engagement with the enemy. The enemy has a piece of my transformation. That's a powerful, difficult, but powerful reality that we're always, Apache Bene and Campaign Nonviolence, struggling to live and to engage and to embody. I used to have a little peace pin, and it said, love your enemies. Love your enemies. It really confuses them. So that notion that's the unexpected script. And it doesn't mean, as Dr. King said, love is not sentimental bosh. It is regarding the person that we're in struggle with or that we're engaging with, regarding them the way we regard the most beloved person in our life. It's not condoning their violence or their injustice, but also recognizing that even deeper than their violence is their infinite worth, that they are deeper than their violence. Each human being is deeper than that. No cooperation with humiliation and injustice. Nonviolence is not being a doormat. Nonviolence is about actively non-cooperating, withdrawing consent from anything that humiliates, anything that is unjust to ourselves or others. Nonviolence is working for the well-being of all. It's fearlessness. It's a recognition that all life is one. And difference without division. The sense that we're all different, and differences are critical and important and need to be celebrated. When I'm over here, I see the world slightly differently than when I'm over here. But at the same time, also, we are one body. We are all one. So difference without division. Can that be our mantra as we go forward? Differences without division. Ryan, if we can go to the next one. Each of us has a piece of the truth and a piece of the untruth. Resist us versus them thought and behavior. The means must be consistent with the ends, and human beings are more than the violence they commit. And then, if we go to the next slide, Ryan. Again, we highly encourage in the construction of our actions to take seriously Dr. King's vision, a vision that has not been fully realized yet. His vision of the beloved community, a multiracial, democratic, nonviolent society. And these were tenets of this approach, including nonviolence as a way of life for courageous people. Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, but not people. And sometimes we get that muddled and messed up. We can seek to defeat anything that is destructive, dehumanizing, diminishing, but the persons who are carrying out that violence, there's more to them than that. And there's the possibility for transformation and for healing and even reconciliation, that beloved community in spite of everything. Nonviolence holds that voluntary suffering can educate and transform. We talked about that earlier. Nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. It chooses love instead of hate. And nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. This notion that we have it within us to build a world where everyone, their infinite worth is valued and upheld, where we meet the needs of all, and that we, as difficult, as challenging as it is to see that possibility, this sense that Dr. King bet his life on, that in the end, justice is a value that is embedded in every human heart, and that can be realized. In spite of all the violence and injustice in our world, we are seeing thousands of nonviolent movements, campaigns, and actions happening all around the world now that are showing that we can create justice. 87 steps forward and maybe 57 steps back, but we can create justice. As I mentioned on a couple other calls, there are some really great resources out there that help us see that we're not alone in all of this. So to Google the Global Nonviolent Action Database, which has over 1,000 cases of nonviolent movements by category, and actually there's a certain amount of analysis that's happened to show how successful or not that they've been, and also Waging Nonviolence, which daily serves up stories of active, creative, challenging nonviolence. So as we reflect on our possibilities for change, I invite us to seriously think about the nonviolent options that we can actually organize, the nonviolent actions that we can participate and be part of. So just a few years ago, I worked with Witness Against Torture. And we did this amazing action on the steps of the Supreme Court, which had not yet at that point, this was 2008, yet had decided definitively anything about opening the possibilities for those people at Guantanamo Bay to get any kind of justice. And it was a powerful action. And what we tried to do was to bring the names of those who were languishing in Guantanamo into the U.S. judicial system. So we took their names and took them into the system. And pretty soon the system started writing down their names. And when we went to court, we used those names as we addressed the judge and so on. And it created the not just for ourselves, but for the possibility for change, even in the court. And 3 weeks after that trial, the court, for the first time, opened the possibility of those kinds of beginning the process of that kind of judicial relief. I see there's a question from one of the participants here. So Ryan, what's that question?
Hi, Ken. Yeah, we have a question from Debbie who asks, my church group is not necessarily aware of nonviolence and is made up largely of elderly members. If we were to choose a cause or concern and hosted a prayer service, could we consider this an appropriate action? It might raise awareness.
What would be appropriate? Can you say that again?
If they were to choose a cause or concern and host a prayer service, could that be considered an appropriate action?
Yes. Is it Debbie?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Debbie. Here's what I would encourage you to think about, which would be where you hold that prayer service. If you were to hold it in a visible public space, so for example, you could have a prayerful procession from your religious community to an appropriate public space in your city or town, to bring that prayer into the public square. This would be a beautiful Campaign Nonviolence action. We would be excited about this and would want to share that. So yes, that would be great.
Thank you, Ken. We have another question from David, who asks, you talk about connecting a movement of movements. 5 or 10 years from now, what might this look like during the Campaign Nonviolence Week?
That's a really great question. I invite all of us to do that kind of visioning. So, for example, if we decided as a movement that it was appropriate and necessary to dramatically cut the U.S. military budget, if that were part of our campaign, and there are really great groups that do pursue a campaign like that, like Peace Action nationally, But if we decided to do that, we could easily connect the dots. Part of the reason for that is because the money that goes to war could be devoted very concretely to meeting human needs and beginning to relieve, perhaps not end, but relieve poverty and create support systems that don't exist for those who are racked by poverty. But also, those monies could be used for a carbon-free future, and would also quite likely, if the military budget were lower, quite likely would mean a lower environmental footprint for the Defense Department, because that's very, it has what the Pentagon does often has huge environmental impacts. So we would, if we decided that was, if we as a movement decided that was a way to connect those dots, then we would make that case, and it would be part of an whatever efforts are being pursued by various anti-war, environmental, and anti-poverty groups, and we would be able to pool our people power in a way that separately we are not able to. So I have a vision, speaking of nonviolent action, of one day being part of a 30-day Zazen meditation presence surrounding the White House for 30 days, thoroughly nonviolent and thoroughly trainings going on at the same time, support systems going on at the same time. And it could be this amazing peace village, or get as close as we can to the White House. And that's connecting those dots. We could bring streams of movements that don't work together already together to do a very powerful action. And that could be replicated in other parts of the country and around the world to help. And what would that do? If we did it in a powerful, non-violent way, willing to face the consequences of that, but doing it in a very centered and trained and very organized way, build this city within a city in Washington, that could very well create the conditions for a real conversation in this society, and perhaps even move the power holders off their position. Let's say at that point we wanted a 20% cut in the military budget. We could be working with groups that want to see that, fiscal conservatives who want to see that, for example. So, but you know, David, here's the thing. I really appreciate your asking me that, because I think we need to ask everyone, ourselves and others in our communities, let's think big. Let's help create the conditions for those kinds of nonviolent actions. My experience with all of this nonviolent work is, and especially taking it public, is that not only do we have more power than we think, we meet people we never would meet otherwise. We are in situations we wouldn't be in otherwise. And often we help our society to engage and grapple with issues that we never had to deal with before. So in addition to what I shared, I encourage you, David, and the rest of us to be doing these, well, as I mentioned last week, remembering nonviolent action, and then working backwards from that. Let's imagine that we've actually done that action. All right, well, we're coming up, thank you for that, David. We're coming up to the end of our time together. Thank you so much for all you're doing, all of you, to build a world where everyone matters. And We highly encourage you to be with us in September 20 through the 27th, and also be with us for a week of actions in every one of the 50 states, and join us for the nationwide Nonviolent Action organizing call July 16th. Thanks so much, and we highly appreciate all you're doing for a world of peace, justice, and sustainability.